Now for today's program. Rabbi Michael Strassfeld graduated from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College at the age of 41 and served as the rabbi of New York congregation Anshe Chesed and then at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism until his retirement in 2015. He was also a faculty member of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. Michael was one of the editors of the Jewish Catalog, which was first published 50 years ago and has sold over 300,000 copies. He also edited the second and third Jewish catalogs and authored several other books, including his most recent, Judaism Disrupted, a Spiritual Manifesto for the 21st Century. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, covering education, science, and culture, and where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Rabbi Michael Strassfeld and Amy E. Schwartz.
This book is called Judaism Disrupted, in what I take it is a nod or a sort of an ironic tribute to the new heroic personality of our time, which is the disruptors who, quote, what's the quote? They move fast and break things. So your big disruptive insight into Judaism, if I'm reading this book correctly, is that we need to disrupt Judaism's reliance on dualities, on distinctions, essentially on hierarchies, and that's kind of a big move because Judaism's all about distinctions traditionally. Can you explain why this is so important?
Sure. I do think it's critical, and I think it comes to the issue of the difference in the world that we're living than was in the past. I mean, to speak in a very general way, the Middle Ages, the period before modernity, there was a world that it was very divided. It was, if you think about, medieval Europe, you were either a peasant or clergy or royalty, and part of the trouble for Jews was that they didn't fit into any of those categories. So they were the sort of the odd fit. And the world we live in now, the arc of the world we're living in now is trying to be more inclusive. We've seen that happen rapidly in America in the last couple of decades. It's not without controversy or people pushing back against that. But I think it's the world we not only are part of, but that it's the world we want to be part of. We want to be a world that we feel as Jews and as all the other things that each of us might be, feel welcomed, included, rather than be the outsider or worse, the tolerated minority or the not so tolerated minority.
Right. So you think that, so this sounds like you're talking partly about living in a world with fewer rules about who's in and who's out, fewer judgments.
Right. I think I think that should no longer be of much of concern. And there's underlying that, you always wonder, well, do people think that somehow Judaism will be, watered down or even more conspiratorial, that, people will come in and there was once a discussion, one of the shows I was affiliated with, about, well, if non-Jews can be members, then maybe they'll take over the synagogue or something. And it's just like, really? Like, I don't think what we have is so attractive that people are just waiting.
All the things non-Jews might want to do, the idea of infiltrating synagogue management doesn't strike me as the one I would pick, if I were.
I mean, like if we were Shakers and there were only a few of us and we had this incredible, valuable furniture, then you might be suspect that people say, oh, I really want to become a Shaker.
Oh, you mean
But
actual Shakers,
actual Shakers.
The second I was taking you, movers and Shakers, important intellectual furniture. I mean,
right,
in some
3 or
sense,
4 Shakers and
right. Take the real estate,
right. Or right, if it was like, oh, you have a big property. And I would say it's also, the other piece of it is that there is a real danger in dualities and distinction. It can lead to hierarchy where it, we're not, people aren't just different. There are some people who are better, more privileged, more in, and the people who are less so. And I think we've seen that a lot in human history, that it's hard to not have the distinctions lead to a sense of this group is more important and more superior to the other group.
Right. Well, if you'd grown up in a female in a traditional Orthodox background, as I did, you would have heard many people trying to explain with an absolutely straight face that the fact that men and women were separated in so many ways absolutely did not mean that there was anything lesser about women. It was simply different. So,
I say in the book that as this proof about the distinctions, I use the blessings and the traditional morning blessings, and I said if men said, thank you, God, for not making me a woman, and then woman said, thank you, God, for not making me a man, you could say, okay, it's setting up distinctions. But that's not what the traditional blessing is for women. It's like, thank you, God, for making me what you wanted, So it's, that highlights the problem. Right. It really is not. And yes, people try and make that argument that it's separate but equal. But like the Supreme Court, I think it doesn't really work well. Right.
Yeah. So let's take a step back. I mean, hierarchies. People sort of. I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about how people sort of drift towards hierarchies. It's kind of a default, and inequalities, come as a result of that. But it's interesting, and you talk about this in the book. The instinct to create hierarchies is it's not accidental in Judaism. It's really it seems to be quite fundamental, and go way back. And I'm thinking also, the Jewish community itself for a long time, sort of, maybe even still, maybe not so much in the last few years, is just obsessed with this, for instance, the question of who is a Jew. So
right.
how do we get used to that, or do we want to?
I would say two things. One, first of all, that I talk about this in the book, that that the distinction goes back to the first week of creation, right? And so you could say, well, but this is not just intrinsic to Judaism; it's intrinsic to the universe. If you take the first chapter of Genesis, but I think there, and I think the distinction that remains critical still is the distinction between good and bad, right? Mm-hmm. So God ends each day of creation saying, "Ki tov," it was good, right? Which I think also makes the point that we live in a moral universe, right? God doesn't say, I finished today, check, that day's done.
Yeah.
It's, because that, finished and not finished is a description, but good is a value, it's subjective. And so I think that still remains key. But I think that instead of being concerned about who's in and who's out, that I'd like to say that we now need a Judaism that's permeable, that's really open to the world around us. Because as I said, I think we want to be in a world that is welcoming to everyone. And the permeable world means that there's a real interaction with the larger world around us, which is a challenge in many ways for a minority, but is also not just a reality, but an opportunity. And it is the actual existential. It is the way the world is, for us. That's really our experience, and we have non-Jewish neighbors and co-workers, and increasingly, many Jewish families have people who are not Jewish who are members of that family through marriage, through being relatives, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's both, again, the opportunity and challenge of our time to begin the creation. What would it mean? What would it mean to have a Judaism that was permeable and yet still remains deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition?
So that's the question. I'm sure you don't have, since the whole book is an answer to that question, I'm sure you may not have a one sentence answer, but give me an elevator pitch. What would it mean for Judaism to look like that?
Well, I think first of all, it's to drop the concern about, who is in and who is out, and to understand that there going to be a spectrum of ways that people are part of the Jewish people, from full members to partial members, in and out, or friends of. And I think we're all people struggling for words that could describe that, and also don't feel offensive to people at the same time. So it some of that is just, it's the focus of concern. Like, are we concerned about that, or are we concerned about making everybody feel welcome, whether they're Jews or people who aren't Jewish? There are lots of Jews who don't feel particularly welcome in synagogues and other places of Jewish life, and I think it's the other piece of it, which is again a large part of what the book is about, is why and how Judaism can be important in people's lives, and my answer to the challenge of the possible challenge of the permeable Judaism is that we need to create a Judaism that is vibrant, that people feel really add purpose and meaning to people's lives, and then I think people will want to participate in those experiences, and they'll be important to them in their lives, and that will be true of Jews and of Jewish families that are more diverse than they have been in the past.
So it's interesting because you are, in a sense, you're calling for these things to happen in the community, or for Jews to think this way, and you're also, to some extent, describing a world you see developing around you. Would that be a fair statement? I mean, some of, at least the first part, the permeable part, the American Jewish community is sort of taking on, is kind of moving in that direction. Are you seeing communities around you that practice these values you're laying out in the book, or are some of them more aspirational?
Well, excuse me, both. That is, we're in the midst of this, but I think it's, the bottom line in some level is, with the intermarriage rate among the non-Orthodox Jewish community being so high, it's the reality, and it's hard to, you have to put your head in the sand, really, to sort of but I'm saying that I see it as not okay, that's the way it is, we just got to accept it with reluctance, and still kind of express concern about it, or et cetera, which I think there are parts of the Jewish community are still doing. And I don't think a strategy of saying, well, people who are intermarrying are bringing, an end to the Jewish community, but we want to welcome you anyways, is at all effective, right? So you can't.
Right.
It's but I'm trying to frame it beyond the practical. This is a bad strategy. Bad publicity. I think it's a world we want, and it should be embraced in that way with not with reluctance and with acknowledging it's not simple. It's a more complex world than a world where things are clearly separated and you knew who everybody was.
Right.
And in many ways, and in so many ways, what's true about our current world is things that you thought were absolutely clear, for instance, gender, are not clear, right? It's not so simple, and the notion that things are on a spectrum, I think, which a lot of people use talking about these things, is a useful way to think about Jews and people who aren't Jewish as well. That it isn't either you're in or out, right?
Yeah, the spectrum. Yeah, it's another an image for this sort of permeable universe that you're talking about.
Right, and it's the image of the covenant of the rainbow, right? So it's and which was with the world, the covenant with Noah was not just with the people, actually, it's with all the animals of the world.
After the flood, I didn't know that. Is it with the animal?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and because I think the flood affected the whole world, right? So it's a similar thing in a way. You could say it's trying to make your view wider. Don't see narrowly, right? So don't see it's just about me or just about human beings. I think that's the challenge for environmentalism in the Jewish tradition. It's to think about the whole planet, not just like what's good for human beings.
So one of your we'll come back to other disruptions in a little bit, but one of your blurbs I noticed says, "Oh, this is a great book for underlining. I wanted to underline everything," and I have to say that was also my experience reading it. Is let me write this down. Let me write this down, and there's nuggets on every page that you don't want to forget about. So let me jump into one on page. This is on page 236, where you say, "The world has advanced to a place where the particular and the universal live together in creative tension." The context, again, as we were saying before, the context is intermarriage, where Jews have this particularist strain where they want to just stay in, and then they have this sort of outward universalist strain where they want to experience the whole world. So this idea of creative tension seems very much to sort of speak to the moment American Jews are finding themselves in. Can you, you've talked about it a little bit. Can you talk more about how you come to this idea of sort of creative tension with the particular? Is that something you're seeing in Jewish families?
I think, well, first of all, creative tension or complexity are kind of my favorite ways of thinking about things. I use those words a lot. I just don't see things as simple and white and black, and that's why, like, the rainbow is a better metaphor. And I was struck as I was working on the book in looking at struck by the fact that the first 11 chapters of the Torah, of the Bible, are all about universal Adam and Eve and Noah, et cetera, and that there are no Jews for many centuries in the Bible's telling. So in some ways, clearly, Judaism isn't as essential for the world to exist, right? And I think it's I like to read those chapters as saying, look, we're all, there's a universal element here. We're all created in the image of God, every human being, and yet we're all particular. So, like, I'm like every other human being, and I'm also like completely unique. There's no other person in the world like me, and that's true of everybody, not because I'm special. So it's I think a mistake to live in only one of those places. I think it's not really possible to be universal completely. Like you have a particular story, you have a particular family you grew up in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we shouldn't lose sight, no matter how committed we are to the particular, that we're part of this planet, and we should be caring about other people who are completely unlike us. And if anything, the crisis about the environment has brought that lesson home, right? That what we do here affects people across the world. Our pollution can affect them, and vice versa. And we, it isn't as though we could isolate ourselves and have a perfect carbon-free area where I'm living. It actually doesn't matter so much, because we're living in a totally interconnected world, right? And and that's another piece.
We just went through a pandemic where we saw that.
Yes, right. And that was right. That was like a terrible but powerful lesson of how you can't, in the countries that tried to cut themselves off, were mostly not successful. It's just that's the reality of the world. We live in a very interconnected system, and the bottom line, we always remember that God is the God of the world, is not the God of the Jewish people. And everybody knows that, but it kind of gets forgotten in the way we sort of think.
We don't talk about that. Well, yeah, depends on the context. Well, let me take a step back. That's a good segue. Once we start talking about God, we've got to sort of take a wider view. This is not your first disruption. We're best known, I think, until now for the fact that you created the Jewish catalog 50 years ago, and that was also sort of a way of opening things up radically. Can you remind people of the adventure of the Jewish catalog? I've still got one.
So the catalog, as you said, was just happened that works out that it was published 50 years ago, and it came out of a small group of us who were part of the Jewish counterculture, which was an echo reflection of the general counterculture of the late 60s and 70s, which was a big part, very disruptive, to use that language, of American society. It was critical of the establishment and the established norms of American society in many areas, in dress, and related to sexuality, politics, etc. And the Jewish counterculture was a piece of that. Again, people mostly in their 20s who were looking to. It was different in some ways from the general counterculture, because we were less in revolt against the existing Judaism, but there was certainly a critique of suburbia and suburban synagogues. But it was an attempt to recapture, more authentic Judaism that we thought existed in the past and had been lost in the journey to America, to metaphorize it. And
not that you wanted an old world Judaism per se.
No. So it was pieces of it was eclectic. So we sometimes in the Chabad Shalom, the group that I was part of, which was an intentional community, would say, we want the commitment of social justice and reform. We want the critical scholarship of conservative Judaism. We wanted some of the piety of orthodoxy, and so it was its own. It was taking what we thought of as the best of those pieces.
Did this later morphed into Jewish renewal, or it's a different kind of a?
I would say Jewish. There were kind of a variety of subgroups or different pieces of the. So even there, people talk about the big three. None of us are big, but Chavarat Shalom, which was in the Boston area, was the more spiritual group. The New York Havurah was the more intellectual group. Farbrengen in Washington, D.C., of course, was the more political group. But each of them had all those pieces. It was, partly it was just easy kind of to generalize, that's what they were. But it also reflected some of the reality. And then there were other groups, similar and different, and there was Jewish renewal. Was Zalman Schachter Shalomi was the key person in that. I think it was more. It was very focused on spiritual and one edge of that. For some people, that was the woo-woo part, of it. But it was. But again, it was. And all these things had some reflection in American culture. So, there was an interest in Eastern spirituality and Buddhism, et cetera. And the renewal reflected that, but it was very much a mixture of Zalman's Hasidic background, Jewish piety, but his openness, talk about someone who was very open to the world. Zalman definitely was that person, great model. And he was very interested in all kinds of religious forms and finding pieces that fit with Judaism. So
yeah, I didn't mean to take you. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it was, so there was like, a spectrum of, and then there were other, aspects of, there were, Jewish magazines that came out of the
like Moment, for instance.
And Moment was right. Yeah. Moment was started in that time, and actually, I don't know if you know this, that Leonard Fine, who was the original editor of Moment, asked us to have a Jewish catalog column in the first couple of issues of, of Moment. And
did you?
We did, and it didn't. It's somehow didn't capture the. I think didn't work out so well. So, but
yeah, magazine is still in some ways an old-fashioned institution.
Whatever. Part of the charm of the catalog was that we didn't think of ourselves as writers, and that we were writing this book that was going to be famous and stuff like that. So there was a little bit of a naivete to it that made it refreshing. And by the time Moment started, we knew that it was successful. So, maybe it was hard to capture that and to find that in print, whatever reason.
Right. No, that's interesting. No, I didn't mean to take you too far into the weeds, although this history actually in some ways is helps explain the landscape a little bit 50 years later, the Havurah movement and all these independent minions and,
right.
Ritual and all these things. But just to go back to the catalog, if I'm thinking about this correctly, if I'm framing it right, the common denominator and the thing the catalog really hooked into in the culture was kind of this sense of empowerment of people not being so subject to what the existing synagogue did or what the rabbi said, but doing Judaism yourself, right?
Right. I think that was the essential message, and the one that was, I don't know if it was revolutionary, but was was really different from the time. And the book, the catalog literally was to give people not just to encourage that, but to say, and here's the information you need to do that, which really wasn't very accessible before that. And we couldn't, it was, in some ways, the idea of the catalog came from the Whole Earth catalog, which was a big, kind of bestseller in the counterculture, and also a large, even larger paperback. But we realized there they would point you into a book that could give you all the information. For instance, there was a thing about building geodesic domes, Buckminster Fuller. So they would say, here's the book, and they would have an excerpt from the book and some pictures from the book. We couldn't do that Jewishly, because the information was like in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. So telling people where in the Code of Jewish Law to find this information wouldn't be helpful, because it's in Hebrew and it's not really accessible. And it also doesn't actually tell you how to. It just tells you, here, these are the rules for doing this, not like, okay, take a 2x4 and cinder blocks, and here's how you build a sukkah, right? So the booth for fall holiday. So that's why originally it was called the Jewish Whole Earth Catalog, and we just called it the Jewish Catalog.
Copyright issues or something.
Well, we also, it could be, I don't know, who knows? Whatever. But
so in a world before the internet, right, and in a world before Sefaria, where you can just look up, you can just keep, go to a website and every Jewish text is available in translation at the tip of your fingers. So you'd take the Jewish catalog and you'd find out, oh, well, I want to do this home ritual. How do I do it? I want to, I don't need, I don't want the rabbi, I don't want to ask the rabbi about this. How do I just make this happen? A ritual or a meal, right? Or things like that.
Right. All the kinds of things. Yeah. Including like a recipe for baking challah for Shabbat, to like how to tie the fringes, the strings on a talit, the prayer shawl. So, from broader things to more specific things. Mm-hmm. And it was all about giving people access. And I think the other message that was conveyed by the look and the pictures is that the people doing these things, the editors and all our friends who we asked to write chapters in the book, look just like every other American.
Just like you, Judaism. It's just like you, right? You could do these things, not be whatever, your parents.
Right, not be your parents. And also, like in the past, before that, like whenever a book wanted to show Jews, they would have pictures of Hasidim, because by their dress, they were clearly Jews. Mm-hmm. And by our dress, we were clearly Americans. We were Jews. And so I think it became, this thing, like people like me can do this. And everybody looks like happy in this book. It's like it's a joyous celebration rather than here's a list of things you have to do.
You're going to get wrong,
right, you're going to get wrong, and make sure you get them right, and you got to do all of them. You can't do just some of them. And it was the opposite. It was I don't know when we became conscious of the fact by calling it a catalog. It means a catalog you take from it what you want. You don't take everything. And I think that was there were other books of the time that like how to be a Jew kind of books. Right. And I think there was a message that they like this, you got to do this stuff to be a good Jew. And this, we didn't take that task. We left it more open. Mm-hmm. Right. We just and the truth is, in certain ways, I feel my life has been dedicated to making Judaism accessible, to take the I grew up in a modern Orthodox home. I went to a modern Orthodox day school. I have a really very good Jewish education, and to take that and make it available to people who didn't have that background and didn't have that education. Mm-hmm. And I think people often feel intimidated that there's an awful lot of stuff in Judaism that you're supposed to know, and I know almost none of it. People say to themselves, and to say no, A, you don't have to know everything, and B, here you can find this stuff out, and people still tell me like, oh, when this holiday comes up, I go and check the catalog because I can't remember the details. Like I know something, but I just don't, and that's great. That's empowering, and that also, I think, one of the big barriers that people feel in participating in Jewish life is that, oh, I don't know, and therefore I can't participate, or I'm going to look like an idiot if I show up in a synagogue and people are standing, then they're sitting and standing. What's going on? Like can't figure it out.
What are they doing?
Yeah. And then someone comes over to you and says, "You're holding the book upside down, right?" Because it's in Hebrew. It's what so it's like you feel everybody there knows, even though the truth is that in many liberal synagogues there are a lot of people who don't know, but they come regularly enough to know
which side the book,
where to stand, or and which way to hold the book, and
right.
They know enough to, I don't want to say the word pass, but they know enough, so they don't feel like they're strangers in a foreign land.
Mm-hmm. So this is very much, it sounds to me, this is very much a through line to the current project. I was thinking when you said that about the catalog, where you can take what you want. In the introduction, not the one by you, but I guess the preface, I'd call it, to the current book, there's a really lovely, passionate story by a woman who's confronted by someone who's got this buzzword, well, isn't it true that all these modern religions are just kind of supermarket religions where you pick and choose what you like and you discard the rest? And she launches into this kind of passionate defense of taking what you need, because the point isn't to do what the religion says. The point is to use it to become a better person. And that's one of your major themes, isn't it? I mean, can you talk about how this carries through to the current project? Then I have a couple more, smaller questions that, I don't want to lose the chance to ask specific questions.
Sure. Yes, I think that's critical, and it's related to what I was just talking about in terms of people feeling. I think people feel like they're bad. People say, "Oh, I'm a bad Jew," or mediocre Jew, because they think what Judaism is going to synagogue, keeping kosher, observing the Sabbath and Jewish holidays, and I think Judaism is about wisdom and practices that help you live your life with meaning and purpose.
You say in there somewhere, it's not to become a better Jew, it's to become a better person.
Correct. It's to become a better person, but to become a better person through the wisdom and teaching of Judaism. And yes, there are other wisdom traditions and other religions that also have teachings, and some of them are similar and some of them are different. There's not just one path. I believe in pluralism, but this is probably the path I grew up in, and it's a wisdom tradition that's 3,000 years old, and I think there's a lot of practices, and part of one of the other, I think in some ways radical things I'm doing in the book is transforming rituals into an awareness practices. Mm-hmm. That is saying, we're not doing this ritual just because Jews have always done this ritual, or etc.
Because God wants us to do this ritual,
Mm-hmm.
Or because God wants us to do this ritual.
Or because God wants us to do it, or to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people. That's the kind of secular version of God wants us to do it.
Right.
But it's because it's going to enrich your life. It's so. I mean, just to use Passover, which is coming up as we're talking, it's to focus on this really important theme of freedom, and we, in many ways, we live in the land of the free, the United States, but both personally and in terms of our society, there are ways that we're not free, or there are certainly ways that some people in America are not very free. And so it's an ongoing challenge to live your life in ways that increases, both your ability to act in the best way you can, which means not being, held back by chains, whether it's feeling I don't really know what's going on in this city, I can't go there, or I don't do these things well, or I'm anxious about doing them, all those kinds of things. Mostly many psychological chains, I think, as well as real life change, to make that distinction. But also in our society, like we're supposed to be helping to make the world a better place. And the ideal would be to ensure that every image of God gets to live a life, fully.
You mean every person who's an image of God?
Yeah, every image of God, every person is an image of God. Yeah, Susan Shorthand, thanks for the correction.
Just making sure I get.
Yeah,
yeah. So like, how would you use this book at the Seder, for instance, since the Seder's coming up? Or not the book, but how would you use the ideas in the book at the Seder? What would it look like?
I think it's to look, and one of the challenges of Seder is that there are all different kinds of people there, and often people with different ages. So it's a big challenge when you have young children and adults at a Seder, and you might find a way to have part of the time focused on the kids, because it's important to engage them, and then maybe they could go in another room, and then you could have an adult discussion about the themes of freedom. But I think part of it is not to see it as just this ritual that either you're reading through quickly, or you're reading the central part of the Haggadah that I think many people, of a traditional Haggadah, many people feel lost, like I don't really know what's going on here. It doesn't really tell the story in a way, though some modern versions do have changed that. But to find a way to focus on the issue of freedom, and to have a real discussion about it. One year I was struck. I said, wait a minute, Roosevelt has 4 freedoms. Like 4 is a perfect number for the Seder. There's so many 4s.
There you go.
I kind of did a little research about it, about the 4 freedoms. There was actually Norman Rockwell's iconic paintings appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in the 40s. So it was during World War II, and accompanying them, there was an article about each time. It was freedom from fear,
For fear, freedom from want. What are the other 2?
Freedom. The others 2 are freedom to worship.
Right, freedom of worship. Yeah, freedom from.
Yeah, it's two each: freedom from,
freedom of speech, freedom of.
Yeah, so
freedom
one
of speech, freedom of religion, and then freedom from want, freedom from fear. Right.
Right. Good.
Very, very.
So and
very
actually,
singular.
one of them, I think it was freedom from fear, was a powerful article, still powerful, because it was set in World War II, and the fear of being bombed, by German bomb. It was still relevant. Some of the others were not, but we didn't even focus on those. I just asked 4 people, each one, to take one of those and talk about what would it mean to freedom from want, and to talk about it. And then we had a conversation at the table about it. And that's not it's to think the person leading the Seder should give some thought to like how they want to have a discussion about it,
So talk about
or
things that matter, right? That's the key. Like talk about
yeah,
things that really matter.
well, yeah, things that matter, and and broadly about this issue of freedom, right? In America, there's a great conversation.
Right.
I don't know if it's great, but libertarians have one
Yeah.
notion of freedom, more freedom, the better, and others that say, wait, but there's obligation that comes with freedom, right? And
Right.
isn't that sounds like a very Jewish thing, right? In other words, you're obligated to give tzedakah. It's not like, if you moved, if you feel compassionate, you should give. Rabbis always say charity is a bad translation for tzedakah because charity comes from the Latin. It means compassion. So you're giving because, I feel badly for these people. But tzedakah is you have to give whether you feel badly or not, right?
So
And
that's sort of righteousness, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's the law. It's not right. And
Yeah.
one of my principles is social justice, and I go through that, and then finally say, yeah, but in the end, there's some really interesting teachers yet that say, but an even higher level than giving because it's the law is to give from compassion. In other words, to go back to a sense that to cultivate generosity and compassion as a basic element in your life. So then, of course, you want to give.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the person. I'm moved by those things. Like I would never think not to give because that's so who I am. That's an even higher level than saying I have to give by law. It's interesting.
It's interesting. Another case of the sort of the commandments making you a better person as opposed to just telling you what to do, right? And so another idea that emerges from your book, which I wanted to ask you about. A lot of your readings, part of the book is about sort of reframing these moments and turning them into loci of awareness. Using these practices to sort of increase your awareness. But you also, a lot of the readings, there's a part of the book where you talk about Genesis. A lot of the readings, for instance, of Genesis seem to me to be reframing the stories with an emphasis on choice, on people's choices, and on sort of outside the garden, for instance, there are choices. There isn't leisure, but at least you have the choice of all these things. The world of Cain and Abel, the consequences of choosing one thing over another, one path of action. So choice is a big challenge in this. Is this a new Torah for sort of a world of abundance as opposed to, the world of scarcity that we might have come up in?
That's interesting. That's an interesting insight. I certainly think there's some truth in that. That is, in a world where basically almost everybody was working hard just to survive, right? And I wondered actually, because I thought of that in the context of thinking about Passover this year, whether in some ways the Passover meal in the past was like, this is the one time a year we like actually get to have like a full meal, whatever that was, right? But the other times it was pretty skimpy, and you were lucky if you were, you didn't go away hungry from your meal.
Right.
So, and I think that's also affected. I think a lot of the challenges for us in terms of whether it's freedom or cultivating these different qualities. We now, like, obviously we're now there's a challenge in abundance, right? That in itself is and keeping up with the Joneses, is probably more prevalent than it may have been in the past, because it was like, the Joneses didn't have anything and we don't have anything. So, what's the keeping up?
Well, you can still covet. We were talking about you've got a thing about coveting. Why is it such a big deal to not covet your neighbors?
But I think, related to that is I think so. I think a lot of the challenges are in the psychological sphere. That we struggle more with our inner landscape than people in the past. Not they obviously were, but I think we're both, because we're post-Freud, more attuned to how these things, how much we're influenced by psychology and our inner self. But I think that's, in some ways we also have a luxury, to like worry about our careers, just to use that as an example, where before, like, it was like career is like I'm working, and like there's a big difference between, I think many of us think of our lives as careers. Not everybody in this world, and not everybody in the United States, but I mean, there are plenty of people that are struggling to get by. But I think many of us, and in the Jewish community, not everybody again, we're looking for purpose and meaning, which are much more interior issues, and the things we struggle with, and unhappiness and depression, and all those things are the challenges of the interior. I think I may have said someplace, America is built on the notion of the frontier, but now the frontier is interior, right? That's where we're going, places unexplored.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, the interior frontier, huh?
Yeah, because there isn't that much frontier, the land frontier left, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think I think again, a good insight, that I think choice is really critical in the biblical text and in Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's very much the way I read the Cain and Abel's story. And it's, which is, there isn't any way to make choices in the world without hurting people sometimes, because you can't choose everybody. So one of my, like, I'm sort of like, well, why didn't God just take both Cain and Abel's sacrifices? What's the big deal?
Like, what was he thinking? Yeah,
right.
It's a very sad story.
Well, and the thing about choice, if you look at it, and the whole book of Genesis, like, hello, isn't the obvious rule of parenting, don't choose one child over another? How many times can the same family make the same mistake? Right. Well, the truth is, we all make, we may not make exactly that mistake, but we all struggle with those kinds of issues. But the point is, you can't choose everything, and you're going to fall in love with somebody who doesn't reciprocate that feeling, right? Or they'll fall in love with you and say, look, I'm sorry, I'm just not, I don't feel the chemistry here. I don't mean to hurt you, but so there's, and you can't say yes to everybody. You're not going to have 50 spouses, right? So that's the nature of a world which is limited. But what you try and do is make choices carefully and consciously, and try and be as least hurtful as you need to be. But knowing that this is the challenge, right? That's what it means to leave the garden. We're living in an imperfect world, right? And it's a world of struggle, and the Bible talks about it as a struggle to earn a living, and that's still obviously part of it. But I think it's as I just said, it's broader than that. It's again, live a life of meaning and purpose, a phrase I like to use a lot.
Meaning and purpose, right? So I have one more question, and it's sort of related, and then I should let you go, because we've been talking a while, and I appreciate it. This is a great conversation.
Thanks.
Most of your book's not about Israel, but there is a part about Israel toward the end, and you say something that really, really caught my eye. Maybe just because Moment is working on an Israel issue for the 75th anniversary, we didn't expect all this craziness and all this news, but there it is. And you mentioned that there's the Torah, the traditional Torah of the Jewish people, and then there's a new Torah of Jerusalem. And in the Torah of Jerusalem, the Jewish people take on the moral burdens of sovereignty, of actually running a country, and that this is, they're writing a whole new Torah of new lessons. Can you talk about that a little bit? I thought that was a very striking
Sure.
insight.
I should just say that in my previous book, A Book of Life, Embracing Judaism as a Spiritual Practice, I have that more fully fleshed out, the notion of the two Torahs. And I began by just, it struck me that, wait, when we return the Torah to the Ark on Sabbath, we say, from out of Zion shall come the Torah. And I said, what is it? What's the prophet talking about? Like, Torah is from Sinai. Where's this? And I'm not sure what the prophet meant. But so I began to develop this notion of two Torahs and this that having sovereignty means that, as you said, the responsibility is yours. You can't say, well, in America we could say, well, we were in favor of this, but other people in America were in favor. It didn't pass in Congress, so that's the law of the land. But Israel doesn't exactly have that excuse. And for all those centuries of the diaspora, we were in many ways relatively powerless.
We didn't need halacha on the just war and things like that, and just on taxation, right? We didn't need to develop a case.
Well, not really. I mean, taxation, in fact, in the medieval communities were often involved because, the king or the noble or whoever said, okay, the Jews owe, whatever, $50,000. We don't care how you get it. So the Jewish communities did talk about, there wasn't, in that sense, I mean, it's right to correct what I said. In that sense, there was an internal governance in Jewish communities.
I see what you're saying.
And they had rules and stuff like that. But they clearly, they didn't do war, and it was, was a sub-government that always was the secular government, to call it that, always had the final say on all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like whatever, I don't know. It was like
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So I think that's one of the challenges of Israel, and you see the challenge of living in realpolitik. I mean, just look at Israel and the Ukraine, right? So Israel won't send weapons to the Ukraine because they don't want to piss off Putin, who is a major player in the Middle East, because of their role in Syria, etc. So, well, I think many of us look at this, they're like, Ukraine, support the Ukraine. This is horrible what's happening.
Right. An easy question, morally, right?
But, and you see, it's not so simple when you're a country, so I'm not trying to defend all the countries during World War II that, didn't admit Jewish refugees, but you realize it's not so simple, and Israel, and forget about policies about the West Bank and stuff like that, which people have very strong agreements and disagreements. It's just like this, the Ukraine is just a perfect example of how, as a country, they have to make decisions that are, are not the decisions that people who weren't responsible for a country would make.
Right.
It affects them. It's hard to be moral and be a country,
hence
in the world,
yeah,
right?
so
that has to have allies, and and you have to make nice to people that you don't maybe wouldn't normally, right? So we see that, and that's, and what I try to say in the chapter here, in the new book, is that, what I still believe that what we and the Israelis share is a vision of the future, where everyone would sit under their fig tree and no one would make them afraid. And we are far from that vision, and we often fail to act in the way that would lead to that. But I think that's what we hold in common. And needless to say, this moment is a very challenging one, for American Jews and relationship to Israel. And I have no magic wisdom.
No, but I'm thinking that these people out on the streets, you could say, I mean, would you say they're writing the Torah of Jerusalem? I mean, they're out there sort of making new.
Look, and this might be, if this is the end of our conversation, I think that we're all writing our Torah. That the 613th commandment, if you go through the Bible from beginning to end, is that every person should write a Torah scroll. And while it's understood literally, which meant in the Middle Ages almost no one was fulfilling this commandment. I want to read it metaphorically, because in that way it's actually a commandment that every Jew fulfills. Many of them don't know they're fulfilling it, but each of us writes the Torah of our lives by our deeds and our misdeeds, and our hopes and our failures, and that's what life is about, and that's what Torah is about. And in that sense, there's a written Torah, which is the Torah we have inherited. But I want to read the oral Torah, not as the Talmud, which is the traditional way of it, but as it's the Torah that each of us writes. It's the one that's unfolding in this moment, that each of us adds to the written Torah, our own understandings and by what we do and what we fail to do, and that's our mission and our opportunity.
Well, I love that. That's a great thought to go away with. Thank you so much, Rabbi Strassfeld. Again, the book is called Judaism Disrupted, a Spiritual Manifesto for the 21st Century. And good luck with it.
Thanks.